we go, yeah.
Ready?
Mhm.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Public Interest in Environmental Law Conference. Thank you for coming to our panel, Reimagine Recreation. My name is Abigail. I'm a 1L PIC volunteer, and I'll be moderating the panel. I just have a few announcements, and we'll get started with the panel. Don't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar, so all the attendees are automatically muted with videos off. So you will you will only be able to see the panelists. Throughout the panel, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. All of our panelists will be giving their presentations, and then there will be a 15-minute Q&A session at the end where the panelists will answer your questions. Please remember to be courteous of all viewpoints throughout the presentation and Q&A session. Additionally, if there are any legal professionals in the audience wanting to earn CLE credit for this panel, there will be a link in the chat to register and pay on JotForm. If you haven't registered, please do so. Also, our alumni board, Friends of Land, Air, and Water, helps to provide stipends for students doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships. If you are interested in making a donation to help provide students with those stipends, information to do so will be on the Google document, which will drop in the link in the chat. Lastly, the University of Oregon is located on the Kalapua Alihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapua people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapua people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Renaud Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indian of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities at DOO and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. TELC would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapua peoples in the Willamette Valley and express our respect for the tribes and nations of Oregon. So I will now introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Christopher Mons, a professor of recreation resources management in the Department of Environment and Society at Utah University. His research specialty is recreation ecology. Chris has served as principal investigator or co-investigator on over 6.5 million in funded research from the National Science Foundation, USDA Forest Service, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Natural Communities Coalition. Finally, he is an author of over 80 scientific papers and reports and 3 textbooks. We also have Judy Brauer, who is a wildlands attorney for the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance in Moab, Utah. She is a tireless advocate who has worked on issues spanning all federal land management agencies, from grazing to off-road vehicles to the protection of endangered species and now recreation management. After 21 years in Boise, Idaho, she returned to Southern Utah's Red Rock country, the place that first sparked her interest in public lands environmental law over 25 years ago. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to the panelists.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks Abby for the introduction. My name is Chris Mons. I'm a professor at Utah State University, and I'd like to present to you today some work that I collaborated with my colleagues at SUA on over the last year or so, looking at ecological disturbance of outdoor recreation with a focus on what is occurring here in the Colorado Plateau in the Utah Canyon Country. So a couple of things we're going to do today. First, I want to fly a little bit at 30,000 feet on this topic and provide to you a little bit of an overview of the field that I work in, recreation ecology, which is focused on outdoor recreation activities and trying to understand those types of ecological disturbances that may occur. So today what we're going to do is provide an overview of recreation ecology, dig into that a little bit. I'll present to you a summary of the work we've done on the Colorado Plateau, the literature review where we looked into scientific studies that have examined these issues. And then we'll try to put it together in a bigger picture in terms of the implications of this work for outdoor recreation management in these environments. Okay, so recreation ecology, again, is the study of recreation activities in the context of how they act as ecological disturbance agents on the landscape. So how they affect things like wildlife, soil, vegetation, water, and air quality. It's a very applied field, and it's a fairly extensive scientific discipline that spans over 60 years with research occurring all over the world. The idea here also is that we want to understand not only the ecological trajectory of these disturbances, but how they affect the visitor experience in parks and protected lands. We use this knowledge to then help managers develop sustainable management strategies. And you can see in this picture here a little disturbance to some of the soil cryptogam that is very common, the soil crusts here in the Utah Canyon country. Looking at the bigger picture of this field, back in the 1970s and early 1980s, a group of scientists started putting together some generalizable theory of how visitor activities from outdoor recreation result in impact to the landscape. That resulted in this fairly commonly referred to use impact theory, use impact disturbance response curve that I've depicted here. So if we look at this in a little bit of detail, this suggests that the initial recreation use, okay, so the amount of use depicted here on the horizontal axis with the amount of impact on the vertical axis, the initial amount of recreation use results in the vast majority of ecological disturbance or impact. In a very susceptible ecosystem, it might proceed incredibly rapidly. In a more tolerant ecosystem, it still proceeds rapidly, maybe at a different rate. But over time, if we continue to use that same area, what we'll notice is that no additional disturbance takes place, even though there's a large amount of increase in recreation use. So again, to repeat, initial disturbance results in most of the impact, and then subsequent use in the same area results in little increase in impact. And we'll come back to this in a few minutes once we talk about some other things further. About 5 years ago, some colleagues and I looked at this historical theory in light of the contemporary knowledge. We published a couple of papers in some scientific journals that brought in the latest knowledge on use impact theory. And we found a couple of things. That common generalization that I just referred to you is still useful. And that's depicted here in this top figure. But we also found that different disturbance regimes, different response variables might respond slightly differently. And one common use function is this S-shaped or sigmoidal response. The point of the matter is with these response curves, still this common idea that initial use results in a lot of disturbance is still pretty useful. And it suggests a couple of things to us in terms of management, that if you have high use, you need to confine use to a certain finite spatial area, and that will minimize ecological disturbance. If you disperse use, you will likely increase disturbance and the effective area that is disturbed. Really, only effective dispersal is in very low use environments. And so as a consequence, this suggests some management strategies when it comes to parks, protected areas, wildlands, and backcountry. I want to make a note that this idea that I'm using the term dispersal, and that is not the common term used by many land managers when they say, well, we have dispersed camping in this location. really that is unmanaged or at large and often results in a lot of disturbance. Okay, we'll talk about this in a little more detail. So this is a little bit of a complicated figure, but putting this all together, here are some of the implications. So first, let's look at this midsection of the figure. Again, we're looking at use intensity and impact or disturbance on the vertical axis here. If we look here at an unregulated situation, this is what, you know, a lot of folks will call dispersed camping or unmanaged camping situations. Frequently, what we see is a proliferation of locations with a high amount of disturbance. And that's in this unregulated part of the curve, right? So we get a fair bit of use. Impact increases rather rapidly to this point here of a high amount of impact, and that's spread over a wide area. Well, if we employ a management action to try to confine that use to a smaller number of locations, we might have a slightly higher amount of disturbance on that location, but it would be spatially confined to a narrower area, a smaller range, smaller area, and as a consequence, overall disturbance in that location, park, protected area, wilderness area, would be much less. Okay, on the other part of the curve, again, this idea of dispersal strategies, this can be done. It's very difficult, but you would need to maintain use levels at a very low level in order to have locations where there was no noticeable disturbance. It can be done, but it cannot be done effectively in high use situations or even moderate use situations. So those are all the implications of the curve. Where we get into trouble is where we're employing techniques that are inappropriate for high use or moderate use, and as a consequence, disturbance can proliferate. Okay, so that's some of the theory on use and impact. There are many other aspects to this literature. I just want to highlight a couple of them right now. Again, this is from the broader recreation ecology literature with some generalizations for us to think about, and then we'll get into more specifics in a minute. If we think about the different kinds of factors that might affect the amount and type of disturbance on a landscape, environment type and the type of activities have been investigated fairly extensively, and both have been shown to be good predictors of the amount of disturbance. So in this first figure, we're just contrasting an alpine meadow area to a forest understory. This particular data were collected in the Wind River Mountains in Wyoming. The point I want to make here, and 100% means little or no disturbance, 100% would be the same as pre-existing conditions, is that these meadow sites dominated by durable grasses were able to tolerate use pretty well. The forest understory, dominated by shrubs, was not able to tolerate the use very well and showed disturbance at a high level over multiple years. And so environment type can have a big factor. Secondly would be the type of activities. A lot of work has been done in this regard. Now, I'm not picking on any one particular activity type here, but the fact of the matter is that hikers, different types of stock use, motorized recreation, mountain bikes, all of these have slightly different disturbance regimes on the landscape. And a lot of work has gone into trying to quantify those differences. And here we're just seeing some data from some work in Montana that contrasted these different activity types when it came to soil disturbance. And the horses had more disturbance than the llamas than the hikers in this particular study. So there's a lot of work on that, a lot of work on different environment types and other related factors. And so it's a very robust field and a lot of consideration for management. Okay, so now digging into more specifics of what we worked on with the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. we were interested in trying to understand some of the trajectory of disturbance on the Colorado Plateau. Here's a study area map here that we were broadly concerned with. We did some compilation of data on visitor use from some key areas on the plateau. And over a 10-year period, there was a significant increase in all of these locations, in some cases quite remarkable. And so we're dealing with places like Arches, Canyonlands, Grand Canyon, other national parks. I will note that the data here is depicted only to 2018, and we've seen significant increases in many of these locations even since that time. For example, Zion National Park has shown about a 20% increase since the data I'm depicting here. The point of the matter is many factors have come into play that influence this increase. There's been a rapid growth in the region of the population. There's been a significant promotion of recreation and tourism in this region, bringing folks in from many locations nationally and internationally. Changes in technology and how people move on the landscape and how they navigate to places on the landscape, including the use of social media. Obviously, COVID has played a big factor in terms of some of the use distribution and increases on public land, and we're still trying to figure out some of the consequences of that. The bottom line is, as David Havlick's book said a number of years ago, there's really no place distant anymore in the Intermountain West, in that increases in all of these factors have led to rapid and sudden increases in recreation use that managers are really struggling to maintain. So we engaged in a extensive literature review to try to understand some key components of the recreation ecology literature that might help inform some management suggestions for visitation on the plateau. And we found a couple of things. There are some very good studies done, and I've listed a few of them here, but it's very limited in terms of scope, and that we've had to rely more broadly on some of these general principles that I just mentioned to develop broader management suggestions. Having said that, here's a couple of good examples of specific studies that have been done. Soil and vegetation disturbance, there's been a number of studies done there. My colleague David Cole and others have published some good work. And a key finding from that work is that the soil crust, the cryptobiotic soil, very fragile, complex soil organisms that hold the soil surface together, are very fragile. They take a long time to regrow, and recreation use can result in extensive disturbance. A lot of good work has gone on in related fields looking at dust and the changes in dust, airborne dust in the landscape as a consequence of soil disturbance. And so that is an important factor for the management of recreation. There's been some good work done on wildlife disturbance, particularly some work in locations where visitor use and key wildlife habitat for threatened species overlaps. So for example, some work done on spotted owls in various canyons suggests that this spatial overlap and disturbance is a key issue. And in cases where we have a threatened and endangered species, it's important to either try to reroute and or minimize that disturbance through directing visitors to other locations or times of year when wildlife are not as sensitive. Another theme in the literature has been impacts to cultural resources. While technically not a ecological disturbance, this is obviously of a lot of importance in the canyon country, Colorado Plateau. Access via trails and roads without active management has shown to be a primary factor. And this gets to be more and more important as navigating to these locations becomes easier and easier with technology, and the posting of information to social media. Okay, so with that, again, a very broad overview of both recreation ecology and some of the literature that we've found in this area. We tried to put together some reasonable fact-based, knowledge-based management strategies, and I've depicted them here. This management strategies range from an unregulated strategy onto a very regulated confinement strategy, as we were talking about earlier. Just briefly running through this, in an unregulated, at-large kind of situation, these are typically applied to many different use levels, but in the Canyon Country and the Colorado Plateau, they're likely to be very ineffective at reducing overall disturbance. One of the reasons is because of the very fragile soil ecosystems we see there. Dispersal strategies typically applied in low use situations, as we've talked about. Again, these are true dispersal strategies where you're trying to keep use levels extremely low. Well, this is likely, again, to be ineffective, and it's because, again, of the very fragile soil systems. In situations where there are more durable surfaces, it's possible that that would be an effective strategy. Two different kinds of confinement strategies here. One that is where visitors are simply encouraged to use well-established locations. Another one where visitors are required to do so. Both of these will likely be effective. The confinement strategy requiring travel and camping in designated sites and trails is likely to be highly effective in these environments. And again, some of it is due to the fragility of many of these ecosystems in these locations. Okay, I want to conclude with a couple of summative points that are related to this discussion, very important to keep in mind. The first is the concept of zoning, and a lot of the information that we just talked about can be used across different management zones, but there are different strategies that might be applied in different zones. So for example, we might contrast a front country area to a back country area. This is very important in that front country might have a different range of management solutions based on the easy access and the high use intensity and all of these concepts that I've listed here. Back country, on the other hand, typically we're looking at more low use intensity strategies, and different kinds of management approaches would likely to be more effective. And I've listed some of them here. An important piece in the backcountry is that the expectation that we all have and visitors have is that there would be less regulation. Where we get into difficulty is where we start to mix and match these management strategies in inappropriate settings. In other words, backcountry management is not going to be effective in front country settings, and front country management may not be appropriate in backcountry settings. And so understanding the appropriate management strategy based on the best available science in these situations is very important. And the last point I want to make is there may be some trends of change in the visitors to our public land areas and our wilderness areas. And I'm speculating here because this is very early in some of this thinking, but there's some signals in some of the survey work that we're conducting with visitors that suggest other things are becoming more important, such as outdoor exercise, friends, doing things with friends and family, than some of the more traditional wilderness-based kinds of things like spiritual renewal. What this suggests is that for some visitors, at least, these front country-ish settings might be more appropriate to accomplish their outdoor objectives. And so we shouldn't be necessarily applying all kinds of management strategies that favor things like solitude in front country settings, as there may be other strategies that would be more effective and be more appropriate. Okay, so to wrap up this, again, I've presented you a kind of a broad overview here: recreation ecology, the kinds of things that we study in this field, its applications to the Colorado Plateau and related areas. And just to summarize here, first of all, what we found in this work is there really is currently limited focused research on areas in the Colorado Plateau, but the robust literature we have in outdoor recreation and recreation ecology can help us throughout and infer a lot. Dispersal strategies tend to increase ecological disturbance. That applies to these areas as well. Confinement strategies tend to reduce overall impact. And these ideas of confinement strategies may be becoming more acceptable to many contemporary visitors. And so they may be very appropriate to apply in very many high-use settings. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen and see if this works. We tried it earlier and it did. Let's see. I think you're not seeing the right one. Is that right? Are you seeing? Oh, here we go. Hold on. There we go. I had to find the right button to push. Okay, I think we're on. Hi, everybody. My name is Judy Brauer, and I really can't wait to get back to be able to see you all in person, hopefully next year. So I am going to talk about, I'm going to kind of follow up on some of the things that Dr. Mons spoke about, to figure out how we can get the agencies to actually implement the management recommendations that his report provided. And again, we're talking about human-powered recreation here, not ORVs, right? We know that ORVs are bad, but a lot of times we go out and we think that we, as hikers or even mountain bikers or campers, don't have much impact. And unfortunately, that's not true. We do have an impact, no matter how careful we are. And especially with COVID and over the past 10 years, the BLM, what I call it, a game of whack-a-mole, right? They see a problem, they try to whack it, and they see a problem, and they use this dispersal strategy, and they say, oh, just go into this other area where there's no use and recreate there, and we'll build some more trails for you. Well, that's a really bad strategy that we're seeing across public lands throughout the West, and particularly in Utah. So this is the report that Dr. Mons prepared for SUA. It is on our website, and it is excellent. So again, how do we get federal land management agencies? And I'm going to focus on BLM here because that's where I do most of my work. However, really the same things, same issues, same strategies apply to the Forest Service. So there's tools and opportunities for both. So how can we get the agencies to be proactive, holistic in their recreation management and planning to accommodate the growing demands? No doubt we have growing demands, but also ensure equitable access, very, very important. And also while maintaining ecological integrity and protecting cultural objects and landscapes. It's a lot to do. Of course, we would love to see some federal and state level initiatives coming out of the BLM or the Forest Service, maybe revising the handbook, instruction memorandum, manuals, directives. Not happening as far as I know, at least not in Utah. However, we did attempt to kind of start something here in Utah. After we released the report in the fall, we sent a letter to the state BLM director requesting the establishment of a working group, a recreation working group that would include a lot of diverse voices in the communities. And he actually liked the idea, right? He is very supportive of needing to address recreation. He recognizes that this is an issue. However, such a working group would run up into FACA, and so it would take a long time to get off the ground. So we're looking at doing this in a more informal manner with, and again, I'm just working in Utah, but in a more informal manner, state and regional level organizations, tribes, maybe some industry folks, we'll see, to see if we can get something on a bigger scale moving forward. But until then, we're really looking at working on kind of a piecemeal basis to address recreation impacts and recreation management and planning. And for most of you who do public lands work, you know there are land use plans and revisions, inventories, there's recreation management plans, all of these things that are opportunities for us to maybe have a say in how recreation is managed and do something about it. I'm just going to say I have a lot of slides with a lot of words on them. I am not going to read those words, so you can read them and I'll just talk about them. So I promise not to read all of my slides, which is always a bit tedious when there's this many words. But FLPMA, Federal Land Policy Management Act, covers BLM lands, has recreation in a lot of different places. It addresses recreation. Recreation is one of the primary uses and values recognized in FLPMA, as well as in NIFMA and the Forest Service. So, and so I'm just going to provide a couple here. I'm not going to provide all of them, but an important one here, I think, is Section 201, where which requires the secretary to do inventories, and it specifically mentions outdoor recreation, which, to be perfectly honest with you, I actually didn't realize until I was preparing for this panel. So I have some new ideas about how to use 201 to get BLM to do some recreation management planning and do some recreation inventories. So what does BLM do with these inventories? It has to actually use them in the development and the revision of land use plans. So these inventories, it's not just a one-time deal, and there's some good case law about that. They have to maintain on a continuing basis, continue doing these inventories. So it's not just they do the land use plan, they do these inventories, and then you have a land use plan from 20, 30 years ago, or even 10 years ago, and they don't have to keep doing those inventories. They actually have to keep doing them. And we as citizens can also provide information that will encourage the agencies to do those inventories. So, and importantly, not only are those inventories for things like recreation, but they are required to, the BLM is required to inventory for lands with wilderness characteristics. And I believe that this is actually a really good tool to get at things like recreation expansion and recreation use, because A, the BLM has to keep those inventories updated, and B, once the BLM identifies an area as having wilderness characteristics, even if it's not managed for wilderness or managed to protect those wilderness characteristics, the BLM has to analyze the impacts of any of its site-specific or land use decisions on those areas. So for example, if the BLM identified an area as having wilderness characteristics, and then they want to go in and develop a whole new trail network and some campsites and put in a some toilets and a parking lot, they have to analyze the impacts of all of that on the wilderness characteristics of that area. So I think this could be is a really good tool at the site specific level to address recreation use and expansion. And in this case, the Rocky Mountain Wild case, which just came out recently, it had to do with oil and gas drilling, but it really is essentially a very similar situation if the BLM was going to go in and develop some recreation use in those areas. And so my question at the bottom is, what about inventories of outdoor recreation? And that is an area that I'm going to explore more. So if any of you have any ideas or information, or you've been working on this issue as well, I'd love to talk to you. Feel free to email me anytime. Okay, so I'm providing here a map that Sua has prepared, and this is a map, and I apologize for it being so small and difficult to read, but this is the Western lands with wilderness character. So these in the kind of green hatched areas, those are areas, just have to look at my notes. Those are BLM identified areas with wilderness character. Okay, so the kind of the green hatched areas with lines, those are areas that BLM itself has identified as having wilderness character. And yes, every once in a while, BLM does do that. The orange is citizen proposed wilderness, and citizens can propose areas for the BLM to identify as lands with wilderness characteristics, to identify as wilderness, designated as wilderness. So these are citizen ones, and SUA has been successful in identifying lands with areas that we believe have wilderness characteristics and getting the BLM to also identify those areas as having wilderness characteristics. Not always, it's a struggle, but sometimes it does happen. And then the dark green, the real dark greens are national monuments. So you got Bears Ears, Grand Staircase, some of the national monuments. And then the light green, which I actually found this really interesting because I didn't realize this. These are all BLM lands with land use plans that are under revision or development. So there's a lot of opportunity here to use the land use planning process to address recreation. And obviously other issues, but all of these green areas are, and there's some missing. I pointed out, and just so you know, I've been given the caveat that this map is a constant work in progress because there's always new citizen proposed wilderness and there's new BLM proposed lands with wilderness characteristics. So it's kind of a work in progress. And the light blue are also other BLM planning efforts. So there are definitely areas where you, our clients can work on addressing recreation management issues. If you can see my pointer, I'm pointing at the Cedar City field office is going through a land use planning process. It's if you're in Utah, it's on the left-hand side, the western side of the state towards the bottom. That's the Cedar City field office. Unfortunately, that's been paused. This RMP has been going through revision for, I think, over a decade. And currently it's paused while the agencies work on the Grand Staircase, Escalante, and Bears Ears National Monument Management Plans, which are also two really important areas where we're going to be working on recreation management planning. And then also kind of in the middle, to the east a little bit of the Utah sign, down south a little bit is the San Rafael Swell area. And that also is going through a land use plan amendment process based on the Dingle Act, 2019 Dingle Act, which designated some new wilderness, a new recreation area, wild and scenic rivers, and some conservation areas. So there's a lot of opportunity for folks in all different states to be addressing recreation in these management plans. So in terms of addressing recreation in management plans, so we already talked about the need to conduct inventories and rely on those inventories and planning. There's actually a lot that goes into recreation management planning in a land use plan, or there should be. These are just 4 different definitions. I actually didn't realize how technical it was and how complicated it is. It's really actually a complicated process to do recreation management planning in a land use plan. And unfortunately, it seems to be a lot of it is based on economics. So there's a lot of economics that goes into these land use plans in terms of establishing where special recreation management areas are, what can be allowed there, what can't be allowed there, recreation management zones, which kind of are subunits of SRMAs. So there's a lot of different things that go into recreation management planning. But they are good tools. So I underlined in the ROS spectrum, the recreation opportunity spectrum, it's along a continuum. So the ROS, the recreation opportunity spectrum, it identifies areas that will be managed as backcountry, primitive, low use, motorized, non-motorized, has a kind of a continuum of use. So that is kind of a zoned approach to land management. And really the BLM has the tools to do this a really good kind of zoned management strategy when addressing recreation. Unfortunately, it doesn't usually do a very good job of that. And I'm going to share with you, and I will say too that this is also, I think, where the updated inventories come in, because the BLM needs to update if BLM needs to do recreation inventories, and it needs to do them on a continuing basis and keep them up to date. But if you can find, based on those inventories, where the BLM, where use is occurring, maybe unauthorized use, unauthorized dispersed camping, unauthorized trail development, then that really provides us with the teeth and BLMs with the tools to go in and kind of shut those areas down or do something better in terms of management planning. But the bottom line is they're not doing any inventories, so they don't really know what's happening on the ground. And I'm going to show you, this is one, I apologize for the smallness, but this is the Red Cliffs National Conservation Area. And this comes from the land use plan that was prepared, or the management plan that was prepared for the Red Cliffs NCA. And this is a map of the management, the recreation management areas on the left. And on the right, it's a list of the recreation management zones or descriptions. And I apologize if you can't read it very well, but I will talk about it a little bit. So the on the map, the yellow, which is hard to see, but it looks like it's more roads. I think it provides access. Those are rural. The orange is front country. The blue is backcountry, and the green is primitive. So they have 4 different zones, and they're managed very, very differently. And I found this very interesting and useful because for example, in the backcountry, it's accessed from the rural zone trailheads or the front country zone trailhead. So it really identifies where that area is accessed from, which I think is important because the front country area may have a lot more recreation, but if they're trying to limit recreation into the backcountry, they shouldn't be developing new and expanded and ever more expanding trailheads and facilities at the trailheads that are then going into the backcountry, right? And they shouldn't be putting in more and more and more new trailheads in the front country. The trail development and things like that should be focused in the front country versus the backcountry. I hope that makes sense. So the backcountry has fewer management controls. BLM staff presence is infrequent. Law enforcement patrols are infrequent. Motorized use is restricted for administrative and emergency purposes only. And mechanized use is restricted to designated trails, so mountain bikes. Okay, the primitive area is even more limited in terms of controls. And that is, and they recognize that it's accessed from front country or backcountry zones. So again, that addresses the issue of trailhead development in those areas. Limited management controls, BLM staff presence is very low. Law enforcement is limited to emergency response. Motorized prohibited except for emergency response. And cross-country travel is allowed only by foot or horse. So, and there's no constructed or maintained trails, which I found very interesting. I didn't actually realize there were that many places like that. So this, I think, is a good example of a zoned approach. However, I will say that I do not know whether the BLM did a good job here. I just wanted to use it as a zoned management approach. Maybe they should have identified more land as backcountry or primitive. That is certainly possible. I don't know, but I do believe that this is a good example of a zoned management approach in management planning. So recreation, I'm going to kind of go through some of the lists that I had in the beginning. So that's land use planning. In the land use plans, it often mentions that the BLM will then do an activity level or project level plan, like a recreation management plan, right? If I could see you, I would ask you all to raise your hands how many forest plans and RMPs you know that have a requirement to do a recreation management plan and they haven't done one. Yeah, exactly. Probably most of you. I know that we are dealing with that right now. And I found it interesting. This is from the BLM handbook talking about activity level plans. So this is actually all one paragraph in the handbook. And it mentions here how activity level plans are, becoming more interdisciplinary, and they're focusing on landscapes and ecosystems. And I don't know about you, but I haven't seen many of these types of plans, at least that are addressing recreation management along with some other activity levels, activities or uses. So be great if we could see that. I believe that is what should happen, because analyzing recreation in a bubble, I think, is not good, but haven't actually seen that. It would be nice to encourage the agencies to be able to do that. So what I would say is check your RMPs and forest plans to see if they do have a place where they have a certain area where they say they're going to do a activity level plan or recreation management plan. Because I think if they do, we can push the agencies to do one. If they do have that requirement in the forest plan or the land use plan, I think we can push the agencies to develop these activity level plans based on the requirement to do updated and continuous inventories. But also, if they don't have an activity level plan and they're continuously developing new recreation areas, new trails, new parking lots, new toilet, putting in more and more toilets, putting in more and more signs, developing new mountain bike systems, then I think we can use, somehow push the agencies to get to actually develop those activity level plans, because they shouldn't just be going willy-nilly and doing all of this without having those recreation inventories and actually an activity level plan. And this is what happened in the 2008, and I had like 4 slides on the price RMP, because this is an area I'm working on very closely right now because of the Dingle Act and the new San Rafael Swell recreation area and wilderness area. So the recreation area is about 217,000 acres, and it's kind of surrounded by new wilderness areas. And the BLM is doing a management plan amendments, RMP amendments, for not only the wilderness areas, but for the recreation area. And with the Red Cliffs National Conservation Area, which was designated in the 2008 Omnibus Act, the legislation said that the BLM shall prepare a comprehensive management plan for the long-term protection of that area. And what the BLM did is they prepared a comprehensive management plan for that area that was then incorporated into the overall land use plan. Well, what the BLM in the Price Field office in Utah is doing is they're just doing a bunch of amendments to their current RMP, and they're not, the language, the designation language for the San Rafael Swell Recreation Area is exactly the same as the conservation area in the Red Cliffs. It says you shall prepare a comprehensive management plan for the long-term protection of this area. Well, BLM is interpreting that very differently for the swell, and they're just doing a bunch of amendments. So we're really trying to push them to do this comprehensive management plan. And importantly, despite its name, the recreation area is, according to the enacting legislation, to be managed for much more than just recreation. There's there's ecological, there's wildlife, there's scenic, there's educational, a bunch of different resources and values that the designating legislation says it has to manage for, in addition to recreation. So they're on equal footing. Recreation, despite its name, is not higher level. And one of the main reasons we want them to develop this overarching management plan for the rec area is because we're afraid that the BLM is going to use the rec area, since it's now surrounded by new wilderness, as a sacrifice zone for motorized use, new mountain bike trails, and just start developing new, camping areas, just really developing it. It's a really important area. There's bighorn sheep, there's Mexican spotted owl, there's a lot of threatened endangered species, plants, things like that. So in the 2008 RMP, it said that the BLM is supposed to develop recreation area management plans in many, many places. It says that they would do that. Well, since 2008, they haven't done that. And you can see at Rec 45, the activity plan was going to address all of these issues that have to do with recreation. Well, it never did that. And so since 2008, the BLM has been managing all of those issues without an actual activity level plan to ensure that that they're not having significant impacts. But unfortunately, based on my field visits out there, they've not been doing a very good job. So we're really trying to push the BLM to do this comprehensive management plan that will include, obviously, recreation as well as all of the other values. And then lastly, I'm just going to mention a couple of pieces of legislation that are out there. These are two pieces of record. So access is really the big keyword, right? We need to improve access. We need to provide more access. Yeah, we need to make access better, but we need to do it smarter, right? We don't want to just open up every single place to recreation. So unfortunately, I think the kind of buzzword on the Hill is that we just need to get rid of the red tape. We need to make things easier for permitting. So both of these bills address commercial special recreation permits, SRPs for commercial use, both on BLM and Forest Service lands. And it would essentially they're looking at creating CEs to make permitting easier. And because I want to provide time for comments, I won't go into the issue that we're having with SRPs in the San Rafael Swell area, in the wilderness areas where they want to increase use there. So it's actually a pretty important issue. So we'll be keeping track of those. And I know I spoke really fast. Thank you very much. And I'm open to questions.
Great. So thank you both so much. So we'll start the Q&A portion of the panel. So please drop any questions for the panelists into the Q&A function. So a question for Ms. Judy Brauer. So what would enforcement of the management strategies look like as people continue to camp on BLM land? And how can we enforce these areas to implement their recreation management plans?
That's a good question. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know. I mean, enforcement is so lacking. And, as I said, in looking at, for example, as I talked about in looking at the Red Cliffs, enforcement and BLM presence in primitive areas and even backcountry areas is pretty low. So enforcement is going to be relatively low there. However, you would hope that people who have the skills and the ability to get into those backcountry settings know what they're doing and respect the land enough. And there's not as many people, so the impacts will be much less because there's so many fewer people who actually can and are able to get back there. So, the enforcement is really happening in the front country. And that also is where I think we're seeing a lot of the growth and use. It's easier access, it's near communities, so people can get out there easier. And that's where the enforcement is. I think that's also where the learning needs to take place, is with providing information and education to people who may be just starting out using these areas in these front country settings. And that's really where the education can take place. And you're educating people of leave no trace, what cryptobiotic soils are, what you should and shouldn't be doing. Yeah, and money, right? We need more money for BLM enforcement. That would be great. We need more money for BLM everything.
Great. All right, thank you. And then for Chris, are there strategies that we can make recreation and forest areas less impactful on the environment? And then would you suggest we change our management strategies as we see an increase in the use of certain areas in the backcountry or areas that are gaining popularity via social media and other realms?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for that. Management has to be adaptive. And as a consequence of the increases and rapid increases that we have seen recently due to various factors, the gathering of systematic data on use, on resource conditions, it needs to occur in order for us to be able to react to these situations in a manner to protect the resource. And so the short answer is yes, we need to be adaptive. We need to be able to build into our management planning frameworks options to be able to develop new management strategies as the condition of the resource dictates, and as changes in recreation use result in different uses on the landscape. I would like to emphasize one point, though, that as we look at more developed settings where we have hardened trails, hardened sites, front country locations, and even some backcountry locations with established recreation routes and sites, use changes don't necessarily result in more disturbance. If we can confine use to those hardened areas, established locations, then oftentimes we don't see use proliferate. So that gives us some options in terms of accommodating some of these big use dynamics.
Yeah, I would agree. And we see a lot of that in and around Moab. If anyone's been down here, you know that it is just pretty recreation tourism heavy. But there are some really good hardened sites, right off the highway, close to town. We're, trying to work with the Moab BLM and folks here to focus on maybe improving and expanding those sites versus there's always this push to develop more and more and more trails in what we've identified as potential areas for wilderness protection. So that's a kind of a constant battle that we're having here and we're seeing around the country. But there are so many good sites, hardened sites that could have some additional trails, add maybe another toilet, add some more parking, or, in most areas there's plenty of parking. So really there are those good opportunities. I also just want to thank really quick Emily and Scott Mathis. Scott, I'm really interested in learning more about what you did. If you guys can see in the Q&A, he provided a good discussion of some of the things he did in terms of enforcement and education, which I think is really key. And Linda, cryptobiotic soils are very fragile soils. They're actually alive. They grow. If you Google it, you can find examples of it and what it is. They're really cool, but they're very fragile and extremely important.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Linda, if I didn't explain that. They're biological soil crusts, and they're a symbiotic relationship between a number of organisms. They colonize the surface of desert soils throughout the Colorado Plateau and in other locations. They're key to nutrient cycling in those communities. They're key to soil stabilization as they hold together those sandy soils and create opportunities for water retention, biological activity, and they're very fragile. And even one footprint can disturb and destroy cryptobiotic soils to the point that they take many, many years to regenerate.
Okay, great. If nobody else has any more questions, I think we're going to wrap up this panel. Thank you so much for the panelists and everybody for coming out. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.